Well, I've got those viewfinder windows all nice and clean now, so that's the top cover dealt with, and I can put that to one side. I need to deal with this rangefinder next. Now it's obviously quite grimy on that front surface. There's a little bit of dust and grime in here. I can see it on the semi-silvered mirror. Some of that's on the front surface of the semi-silvered mirror, the one that faces to the front of the camera. That's plain glass. The rear surface of that semi-silvered mirror is the one with the silvering on it, and that's very, very delicate. The front surface is plain glass, and that can be cleaned with a cotton bud and some glass cleaner quite easily. The rear surface you don't want to touch. Here we've got a front surface mirror, and that you don't want to touch that with anything either. So this rangefinder, I'm going to take this apart now for cleaning. So I start with the screw on the base here, the pivot screw. I've got a spanner that's ideal for doing things like that, but you could get away with a stiff pair of tweezers, which I'm going to use to undo this anyway. Now it's loose. Take that screw off. There's a wavy washer. That arm will come away. There's a brass bush in the arm there, and I don't believe it's anything other than circular when it was turned, but because it's crushed in slightly, it probably acts a little bit like an eccentric. So I'm just going to scribe a line across there so that I can put it back in exactly the same position when I put the rangefinder back together, and that'll mean I won't have to spend so much time doing adjustments, hopefully. The screw here on the back, this mask holds the eyepiece lens in place, and that glass is pretty much flat on the rear surface. The inner surface is convex. Now here we've got the mask with our frame lines on it, and I do not want to put that through the ultrasonic cleaner. They would end up disintegrating. So I've got to get this screw out, and that's been lacquered in place, so it's not enthusiastic. Put a touch of acetone on that. Just to soften that lacquer or paint up. I don't want to press the rangefinder into the bench because I'd be pressing on that frame or on the semi-silvered mirror. So there's a limited amount of downward pressure I can put on my screwdriver when I'm trying to get this screw loose. That's better. Now we're in business. So we've got the screw. There was a washer underneath that screw. Here are the viewfinder frames. And here was a shim that was underneath there, lifting the viewfinder frames up, effectively holding it up in the rangefinder. That is as much as I'm going to strip that down. This can get cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner now. It'll be basically, I just put a small glass into the ultrasonic cleaner surrounded by water. In the small glass I put hot water and a drop of dishwashing liquid. This goes in, it gets 3 minutes, comes out, rinsed under the hot tap, blown carefully to get rid of all the water droplets, and dried with a hairdryer, pretty much all at the same time. Because if you leave any droplets on the glass and you dry them in place, you end up with coffee rings. So you need to be blowing away any droplets as and when you see them. This front surface on the semi-silvered mirror, I can clean that now with some glass cleaner. And the advantage of that is that I only then have to clean the rangefinder in the ultrasonic cleaner enough to get rid of any loose debris on the inside. I'm not trying to get rid of anything that might be on the outside here because I've already done that. And this surface is often the grimiest. And as I said, this surface is plain glass, so cleaning it with a glass cleaner is fine. Once that surface is clean, you can see into it a bit better and you can judge how much grime there is on the other surface, the silvered surface, and in this case it looks quite clean. So this should clean up very well in the ultrasonic cleaner. I certainly won't be giving it any longer than 3 minutes. If you overdo it in the ultrasonic cleaner, it will start to degrade that silvered finishes fairly promptly. So you do not overdo it in the ultrasonic cleaner. Back shortly. This front glass can be cleaned with glass cleaner and a cotton bud. The outside surface is usually the grimiest, of course, but the inside surface certainly needs to be clean as well. Just check there's no smears or anything there. And the eyepiece glass too, of course, needs to be cleaned. I'll just clean that with a soft cotton cloth and some glass cleaner. And that should be simple. Then I'm ready to start putting it back together. I'll start by putting the frame component back in place. It had a shim under the back here to lift it up. Sometimes you'll see a washer in that position, sometimes there'll be nothing at all. Here's the washer and the fixing screw. Paint or something loose there, I'll just get rid of that. Okay, so the rear eyepiece glass we have here, a bit of dust on that surface. That's all cleaned and ready to go. The frame or mask fits on here, and there was a single screw holding that in place. Here's the arm for our rangefinder. I'm going to put the bush back in that. And here I'm using molybdenum paste, but you could give that a light wipe with something else. Not something that's likely to get sticky, and certainly not large volumes of it. Right, so that bush is back in place and it's sitting exactly where it was to start off with. The return spring for the rangefinder runs in this channel on the side here. So I'm just going to put a wipe of molybdenum paste down there so that the spring runs smoothly. Now if we stretch that spring out as I put this arm in place, I've got the bush lined up with a hole in the base of the rangefinder there. I'm going to put a wipe around that on that surface. Put my wavy washer in position. Put the fixing screw in position. And run the fixing screw in. Just checking that the wavy washer is seated around the bush, not on top of the bush, and that the arm moves smoothly. Tighten that screw up. Now I'm going to look out the window and see what sort of result I get. That was good. Everything, it moves smoothly. It's nice and clear. The rangefinder can go back on the body at this stage. So how do we go about doing that? Well, I want the screws for it first. There are two black screws that hold this in place. Normally I'll put a couple of spots of lacquer on here so that the rangefinder doesn't have any tendency to shift. The screws hold it down firmly, but it's not like it's not doweled into position. There's certainly potential for it to shift, and that's what happens if cameras get dropped. So focus set back to infinity. Put my rangefinder on. Bring it back into its seat. Check that the arm on the rangefinder is free to move. If it's sitting on top of the screw for the focus from the shutter, it's going to give you grief. You end up bending things. Alright, so one of the screws you can get into place from the front. If I can find the hole for that to get it started. No. Let's get that rangefinder seated correctly. That's better. And the other screw I've got to drop in from the top. And of course it just drops neatly into place and you can screw it straight up. That's the theory. Sometimes it even works. Okay, so that's in place. I'm holding the rangefinder back firmly against the rail at the back there while I do these screws up, so that it's firmly located. And now I'll look out the window and check the adjustment of my rangefinder. It doesn't, the images don't quite come back to align at the infinity position, so I need to adjust that. So there's their lock screw. And here's our adjustment screw. I need to swing the arm out slightly. Check. Now I've gone past the point where they align. So I'm going to bring that back, the arm back in this slightly. Ooh, a little bit more. That's it. That's just right. I can lock my adjustment. Check it again. You always need to lock your adjustment. Check after you've locked your adjustment, because it's easy to disturb the setting while you're doing up that lock screw. Sometimes even just doing up the lock screw will move the setting. But that's good. The image is nice and clear. I think that if I put the meter back in place, this could just about close the top of the camera up. The meter adjustment here just seems a little bit stiff to me. There might be a bit of dust under there, so I'm going to remove that and clean it. So I'll just pop that circlip loose. And give these surfaces a wipe. There's a little bit of grease on there, and grease just tends to trap dust, and before you know it, instead of a nice lubricant, you've got a nice grinding compound. It's not bad. Now I'm going to check the movement of the follower needle. Just check that it moves freely and returns to the rest position promptly. Sometimes they'll be sticky, sometimes it's down to a little bit of friction at the joint there in the arm, and a tiny drop of oil in there can sometimes fix that. And I really mean tiny. You need virtually nothing. Okay, that all appears to be good. I'll put a wipe of synthetic grease through the centre and on that cam surface there. Put this in place, make sure that that pin is not trapped underneath it. That's better. And put the circlip back in place. And that moves nice and freely now, no hesitation or resistance there. A camera body, what do we need here? We want our shutter release button, our film release button, and the return spring for the film release button for a start. And I'm going to put a little bit of synthetic grease on that cocking rack. That'll find its way into this piece too, so that'll run nice and smooth. The film release button, I usually just run some molybdenum paste through the centre of that where it runs on its guide post. You could use any grease at all to do that. We'll swing the meter into position. Get our shutter release button in position. Check that the meter is seated. Last blow to get rid of any dust. Put the top cover in position. And holding that down in position, I want to check my frame counter and make sure that it only moves one frame at a time and that they're centered up. It's moving far more than one frame at a time. I did think that that setting was quite wrong, and it looks like I was correct in that assessment. This screw here is screwed out far too far. Now that little rubber pad just came loose. That sits in the corner of the top cover here, and that holds the meter down firmly. That's got to be glued back into position. So I'll do that as soon as I've got this frame counter sorted out. I've screwed that screw in on the arm and I'm checking to see what we get. It's moving one frame at a time now, but it's not centered up particularly well. I think we'll adjust that back out slightly. This is something that you would need to adjust if you ever change the shutter cocking rack. Oh, that's pretty good. Just about on it. It was counting at least 2 frames at a time before. That's better. Now it's counting neatly 2 frames at a time. Wind that right back in another frame's worth. If this is too far out, you'll get to the stage where it applies a huge load to the shutter cocking rack and the shutter cocking rack could fail. This is a little bit unusual in its position, this one. I would say that an arm here might be slightly bent. Doesn't matter, as long as we get it adjusted correctly. The lines line up with the centre of the reference point there. That looks good. And it is only 1 frame at a time, so that's good. Our little rubber pad that needs to go back in the corner, I'm going to have to glue that in position. So first I will take a little bit of acetone and make sure that that top cover is free from any oil or grease. Before I attempt to glue it back in place. That's good. And this surface here, it's a little bit greasy feeling. And a little touch of adhesive we want next. If this rubber pad is missing, the meter will tend to rattle in the top of the case. That should be good. Let's get that seated. That just seats right into the edge there at the top. If it's missing completely, and that's not all that uncommon with cameras that have been serviced before, then you can always replace it with a little strip of foam rubber or something self-adhesive. Let's put the top cover back in place. Check my frame counter once more. That seems good. and get some screws into the top cover. Two screws at the end here. Turn this round so I'm not doing it left-handed. That bracket's not lining up particularly well. That's better. And a single screw at the end of the top housing here. That'll probably do for the moment. I may well be getting back into the top of the camera to make the adjustment for the point at which the film release and shutter release at the same, to make sure they release at the same time. So there's no point putting the rewind knob back on immediately, though I can certainly assemble it. There's the screw. Now this of course was stripped out. It may be bent too. I'm going to replace that screw with one of my parts. That's not entirely useless, so that could be used on another project, but not for this one. Well, here's another screw. There's our wavy washer. A little bit of grease on that. That drops down into a recess round that boss there. That goes on there. Screw goes in. Does up tight. Yeah, that moves nicely. So that's our rewind knob. That's for later. Okay, well, with the camera body dealt with, that only leaves me to do the shutter. Okay, let's start putting some of these pieces aside. That's the retaining ring. Have any shims here? One shim, very, very greasy. The rear lens group unscrews, normally that'll come loose with your fingers. Front group, that's bayoneted in, that came off easily. The shutter itself. From the front, someone's been in here. The lock screw here is missing from the lens, the retaining ring. That's probably why the setting ring is so tight. It's probably been tightened down till it won't move anymore. That means someone's been in here servicing the camera, they've lost the screw. It won't be getting a new one from me because everybody else has lost the screws. There are no screws left. Remove all of this. That's the shutter speed settings cam plate. This little piece stops you from being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter's not cocked. This is the cocking ring, the internal cocking ring. Here is the little pinion that drives that internal cocking ring. This is the shutter release lever. This is the spring for the main drive cam. Look at that. That's in quite good order. That's been replaced. Here's the main drive cam. I'm racing against time at the moment because the video camera is flashing its battery light at me and it could stop at any second. And that would be inconvenient. Out with the speed train, out with the self timer. This spring's displaced. That could never have worked properly there. That suggests that someone has had the front off who didn't know what they were doing and have put it back incorrectly. So the camera had faults quite apart from the cocking rack, and it wouldn't have cocked correctly. Okay, so I need a pair of pliers now.